I am an engineer. There are many people who spend a lot of their career characterizing hazards. This is doing detailed studies of debris flows and landslides. But that's not me. I don't characterize hazards. I work on reducing risk. It's sort of the other end of the chain. And so what we'll be presenting today and tomorrow and the next day, I guess 3 days, is what is the process that we use to actually reduce risk. So I hope that after the workshop that you will understand at least how we do it. And I'm sure that there are other ways, there may be better ways, but we will show how we go through the process of identifying a hazard, but then reducing the risk. That's the goal. So I will begin by describing what is a risk. What does that mean when I say that word? And then we will talk about different ways that we reduce risk. So I will begin by defining the terms. So these are the words that you will hear over and over and over again over 3 days. By the end, you should be tired of these words. You should be, I'm sick of hearing the word vulnerability. But I want you to actually understand what it is that we mean when we say it, because there's many definitions for these words. But when we're speaking, we have a very specific and precise definition. After we define the terms, I'll describe ways that we can reduce the hazard. And then we will describe ways that we can reduce the exposure. And last, we'll focus on vulnerability. And so in this presentation, we have about 1 hour. We won't talk about exactly how we go through the process of making a decision. We'll just give you some ideas of how you can reduce risk. And then later, we'll talk about how do we make the decision about, of all of these options, how do we choose? Sound good? Yeah? I will try to stop at a few points and give the opportunity for short questions or discussion. So I'll just ask that you hold your question and then you can raise your hand at those stopping points. Anything to, it's good? Yeah? Okay. What am I forgetting? Yeah. So we'll start with defining the terms. So these are our key terms. Hazard, exposure, vulnerability, consequence, and risk. And I am certain that everyone in the room has an idea what these terms mean. But what I'm trying to describe to you is precisely how are we using it in our presentations. Yeah? So I'll start with hazard. When we say hazard, the simple definition is a potential source of harm, right? So this could be a landslide, it could be a rock fall, it could be a debris flow. But when we say the word hazard in this presentation, when I say it, I'm not just referring to that process type. That's part of it. But I'm also referring to the size or the intensity of the hazard and the likelihood of the hazard. All three of these pieces are needed to understand what the hazard is. Because Shab's getting worried I'm going to trip and hit my head or something. Thank you, Krista. So here's some examples. This is a rock fall. I think there's a neat video here. This is Emily's. I don't know how to start it. Here we go. So this is a rock fall in the southwestern United States. This is at a national park. And so for this is a process type we would call a rock fall. But when I'm describing the hazard, I'm not just speaking of rock fall. I'm speaking of a rock fall that has a certain intensity. So maybe this one was 10,000 cubic meters in size. And it's traveling at 25 meters per second. And it has boulders within it that are 10 meters in diameter. And it has this very large dust cloud that envelops the earth. So all of these three pieces are needed. The last piece being the likelihood or the return period. So in this case, we're looking at an event that maybe has a return period of every 10 years. Okay? So all three pieces are needed. Yes? Lynn's at our office, and I'm told that, no, I'm not doing it right because I'm not supposed to touch it. So this is why I'm confused. Yeah. Good. It has to be like a discrete movement, or it has to be small? Small, okay. All right. Okay, the next example. So that was a rock fall. Here's a hazard, a different hazard type. So we have a rotational landslide that's moving here. Right? This rotational landslide has an intensity or a size that's 1 million cubic meters, and it's actively moving. Every year it's moving. But the thing we're concerned about is if it could accelerate, right? So all three pieces are needed when we speak of hazard. The last one, this is a hazard type that I personally work with very often, and this is the debris flow. Again, as a debris flow process type, ooh, I didn't touch it that time. Huh? Okay, no? Okay, so this is a debris flow, so we have boulders. It's sort of like a wet concrete that's flowing down the channel, a mixture of boulders and sand and gravel. And this one has a size of maybe 10,000 cubic meters. It's moving at 5 meters per second. It has boulders of a certain size. And this one at this particular channel, called the Ilgraben in Switzerland, it happens maybe twice per year. For most hazard types, small events occur frequently and large events occur rarely. Right? This is a key concept for risk management. So this is a histogram looking at earthquakes. I have no idea where, but I think the principle applies everywhere, that you have the small earthquakes happening very frequently and the large earthquakes happening rarely. And this concept is one of the key elements of risk management that we use. We have to make a decision about what are we mitigating on this scale? Are we mitigating? Maybe I shouldn't touch it. Yeah? Okay. Well, it's okay. I can work with this. So we are working in this space where we're working to mitigate the events that are happening every day, or we can be working in this space where we're only working with the very rare events. Okay? All right, that was the word hazard. Do you feel like you understand the word hazard? Maybe raise your hand if you do not. Okay. No, I saw the hand go up there. Okay. Sorry to embarrass. Yeah. Okay, the next word would be exposure. So we have hazard, and then we have exposure. When we speak of exposure, we mean what could be impacted. Double click the screen. Okay. I'll get better. I'm a slow learner, but eventually I will. Okay, so what could be affected by the hazard? So you can have economic exposures. So this is the money that you could lose. You can have people exposed. You can have infrastructure, bridges and houses and schools, or you can have environmental and cultural sites that are exposed. And when we speak of exposure, we need to understand what is the area of potential impact from the hazard. So that's what this map is showing. The different colors are showing you different intensities of debris flow. And this map shows all of the area that can be impacted. And the way that we identify or characterize what could be impacted is we overlay with the map of the hazard, we overlay the elements at risk. So we have here maybe houses that are located around the area. We have a road, we might have a bridge, we might have people who are outdoors or people that are in houses. So we create a list when we begin, once we identify where the hazard occurs, we create a list of what could be impacted, and we call that exposure. All right, so we have the hazard, the thing that's coming down. We have the exposure, the thing that's going to be impacted. And vulnerability is where we bring the two together. So when we speak of vulnerability, we're speaking of how much is damaged or lost given that an impact occurs. And so for each of those exposed elements, the vulnerability will be different, right? So the vulnerability depends on the thing that's exposed, whether we're speaking of a person or a house or a car. But once we understand the thing that's exposed, then the vulnerability will vary based on the size of the hazard, right? So of course, if you have a house, let's say, and the house is hit by a very small landslide, it's not very vulnerable. The house will stand up and it won't be destroyed, right? But on the other hand, if you're hit by the very big monster, then the house is destroyed. So the house is more vulnerable because the hazard is larger. Also, the vulnerability depends on the exposure. So the thing that's hit by the landslide or the flood. And there's lots of details within the exposure that describe its vulnerability. One thing is the location. So like this building here is set back from the river, and so the vulnerability is low because the hazard is smaller and there's more space. Whereas this building that's in the middle of the river has a much higher vulnerability. If you have a building type is important as well. So if you have a building that's made out of something that's weak, of course it's more vulnerable, right? It can be completely destroyed. Whereas if it's a strong building, then the vulnerability is less. And then when we speak of people who are exposed, their behavior becomes very, very important to their vulnerability. If a person knows what to do when a disaster is occurring, they're much less likely to be killed. Right? The next word is consequence. When I say the word consequence, I mean the loss that may be caused by a landslide or another hazard. And again, it's all related to the things that are exposed. So the exposure is like the potential. Like these are the different things that could be impacted. The consequence is this is what was impacted. That's the difference. So there are physical damages. So we call these direct consequences that can be caused by the landslide. This can be things like, in terms of safety, you could have the number of people killed. That would be the direct consequence of a landslide. For a repair cost, let's say if you have a town that's impacted, this would be the cost to clean up and repair. That would be the direct impact of the landslide, or the direct consequence. If you ever hear us speak of an indirect consequence, indirect is something that it's like a secondary effect. So for example, if you have a building that's destroyed and the business is closed, then the indirect consequence would be the days of closure. Right? This is something that happens in the weeks and months that follow an event. And then the third category of consequence that we have is called an intangible consequence. These are losses that really can't be quantified. So in the last example I said the business closure. Well, you can estimate the number of days that the business is closed, and you can quantify that, and you can use those quantities to support your risk-based decisions. But for the intangible consequences, when you have something like a destroyed temple or destroyed ecosystem or a lost sense of well-being within the community, these are things that really are very difficult to quantify and pull directly into an assessment. All right, the next word is called risk. This is the key, right? Risk is probably the most used word. You'll be tired of that word by the end. And when we use the word risk, again, there's many definitions, but when we are using it here, and I think Lauren has a different preferred definition, but she won't get to say it, I apologize. But because we've already established this for our crowd, that the risk is potential for loss, right? So this is saying that you could have a loss, and the risk is like, there's a probability that you have the loss, right? It's what is the likelihood of the loss? And so this is the sum of the consequences, all of the consequences that could occur, times the probability that it occurs. That is risk to us. And actually, the definition, potential for loss, shows up again in the equation. Right? The loss is the consequences, the probability is the potential, describing the potential for that consequence. We often use what we call a risk matrix. So this is a risk matrix, and you'll see that on the risk matrix there are those two categories, the two halves of the definition. So you have the probability, that's the potential for the loss or the consequence. I sprayed it. Okay, and so here we have on this axis the consequence. So when you combine the two, you get a risk. So if you have something that is a high consequence where there's complete loss of everything, and it's very likely to occur, you call it a very high risk. And if you have something that's a very small damage and unlikely to occur, you could call that a low risk. So these are the key terms. Hazard, exposure, vulnerability, consequence, and risk. Yeah? Maybe I'll ask, you have maybe 1 minute. Does anyone have a question or something to clarify? There'll be more opportunities. But if you have it, don't be shy. Shouldn't touch things. Okay, so those are the definitions. Now we're moving on. We're going to move now to, in this workshop, we have a few key messages, right? We're going to throw at you many different examples and many different terms and pictures, but there's a few things we want you to leave with. These are the things that we think that you can apply and we think will be most useful. So the first key message is that hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, they overlap to create a risk. And you're going to see this diagram over and over and over again for the next 3 days, because this is really what the whole system that we use for designing risk reduction is based on this diagram. Now, the fact that you need all three of them to overlap, this is why all three are needed to create a risk. You have to have, so remember this is our map of exposed things. So you have to have something that's exposed to the hazard. If we're only focusing on this house, we would say, well, that's not exposed to the hazard. So this house is not at risk to the debris flow because it's not able to be impacted. That house is not at risk, this house is because it's exposed. You have to have a hazard, right? You have to have the debris flow. And then you have to have vulnerability. So for example, this house here where it's very close and has a high hazard, this one is potentially vulnerable. Whereas this one here, maybe this is a reinforced concrete building, and even if it's hit at a very low intensity, it's not vulnerable. So therefore the risk here is negligible, yeah? Whereas this one there's a risk. So you have to have all three. And this is important because this is what we play with as we design risk reduction measures. We try to take away one of the three legs that lead to risk. So as I said, each of these three components represents an opportunity to reduce risk. So if you want to kill the risk, you want to remove the risk, all you have to do is take away at least one of the three components. So for the hazard side, so this is an example for debris flow risk reduction. You could make a similar diagram for landslides or industrial explosion of a factory or really any sort of hazard. But for debris flow risk reduction, these are some things you could do to reduce the hazard. You could focus on soil conservation or slope stabilization or stabilizing the channel. You could divert water from the channel, and all of these things would reduce the hazard and reduce the probability that the hazard begins. Other things that you could do is you could reduce the probability of impact. So you could say, well, okay, we'll let the debris flow begin, but we will do things like design and build a barrier or design a diversion berm so that the hazard doesn't intersect the elements of risk. So all of these things would be playing with and reducing the hazard. Other things you can do is reduce the exposure. So you can use things like land use planning. So you can make a map that identifies where the hazards are, and you can choose to put things like critical infrastructure, schools and health centers outside of the high hazard zones. And then you can use the high hazard zone for other activities that are more suitable for a high hazard zone. You can relocate infrastructure, so if you can identify the existing buildings that are in a high hazard zone, you can move them somewhere else. And then you can also temporarily evacuate. So you can use an early warning system, for example, to remove people from the hazard zone. And when you do this, of course, you might save a person's life, but you're probably not saving their homes and their livelihoods. So you need to consider that. And then also, if we're speaking of economic risks, you can use insurance to reduce how much is exposed to loss. The third category is vulnerability. So you can reduce the vulnerability by, imagine you have the hazard that occurs, a debris flow that occurs, you have a building that's exposed, and now you want to do something to make it so the house is able to survive when it's impacted. Right? So how does it survive? Well, you can make the building stronger. You can use a building code to encourage everyone who builds a building to make the building stronger. Right? This is the way that earthquake risk is reduced, is by building better buildings that are less vulnerable to collapse. You can also influence the way that people respond through public education. So I'll go through examples of these things for the next 45 minutes. Is that right? So much that time? 30 minutes left. Okay. So the key message here is to reduce risk by reducing the hazard, exposure, or vulnerability. Okay? You can do all of them. There could also be an and here, so you can reduce risk by reducing hazard and exposure. You have multiple options. So now I'll go through some quick examples of hazard reduction. And again, I won't read it again, but this is what I mean by hazard. All three of these components: process type, size and intensity, or likelihood. So when I say reduce hazard, I can mean I can reduce the size of the hazard. I don't have to eliminate it. I can just make the hazard smaller. Right? And sometimes, almost always, you can't eliminate, but you can make the intensity smaller, the size smaller. Or the likelihood. Again, you might not be able to manage those very rare events, but you can reduce or eliminate the frequent events. So I'm just going to run through some quick examples of how to reduce hazard. So one, you can reduce the probability of initiation, the probability of impact, or the hazard intensity. So these are some examples that we have worked on at BGC in Canada. Here's an example. We have a road. This was the image that I showed where the landslide is constantly moving. And we have a series, each of these little white dots is an anchor that holds the landslide into the slope. And that reduces the probability that the landslide keeps moving, reduces the velocity of movement. This next example is a debris flow barrier. Here is a volcano, and the volcano has lahars, I suppose, or landslides that come off of the volcano that flow far to reach a community. And this barrier captures the debris flow before it reaches the community. So we're reducing the probability of impact in that case. The last one here is a series of wooden check dams. These are really large. You can see this is an excavator here, so this is like 6 meters high. And these prevent downcutting of the channel. So that helps to reduce the size and the intensity of the debris flows because it prevents the debris flow from capturing as much material as it goes downstream. These are just a few photos from Japan that show how you could do these in a different way. So we have stabilization of the watershed to limit landslide initiation here and here. And then here we have stabilization of a channel to prevent that downcutting and erosion. And then if you have a lot of money to spend, as they do in Japan in some places it seems, here's a very large landslide that would come down and block the channel and create a landslide dam. And in this case, they've built a tunnel underneath the channel, underneath the landslide. And actually, each of these is an anchor that goes up into the landslide to help hold it into place. I'm not sure that that will be done in many other places in the world, but they can do it there. Okay, so now, maybe more feasible for where I live and work and maybe where you live and work are things like barriers that we know that there's going to be a debris flow that comes down and we want to protect a village or a town. We can build a structure that lets the water pass but captures the sediment and the debris. These reduce the probability of impact and also the size of the event that passes through. Here's another example from Austria, Switzerland? No, Switzerland. Austria, okay. This is a debris flow barrier that's made of concrete that, again, the water is able to flow through, but the debris is captured, so we reduce the probability of impact. All right, glacial lake outburst floods. I know that is a common topic that we'll discuss more of. And with the glacial lake outburst flood, if we have a glacial lake, right, the glacial lake outburst flood happens when we have a landslide or something that comes into the lake that creates a wave, or we have the rainfall that raises the lake, something that causes the lake to overtop. So we can reduce the hazard, the potential for it to occur by reducing the water level. That's what we're doing when we reduce the water level. We can also reduce the hazard by doing anything to break this chain of events that creates the disaster. So anytime we can take away the link, we are reducing the hazard.